Okay, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Vijay Kolinjivadi, je suis une stagiaire postdoctorale à l'UQO sous la direction de Jérôme Duprat. Et je vais présenter en anglais, mais si, je peux répondre aux questions en français si vous en avez. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one of the most, really the only payment for ecosystem service program that has been established in Canada, called the ALICE program, Alternative Land Use Services. This takes place in 6 provinces, but I will concentrate in an example in Prince Edward Island as well as here in Quebec. So, as we know, there has been an increased intensification of production over the last 60 years in North America and across Canada. And this has, as we have heard now, has resulted in biodiversity loss, in erosion and eutrophication, as well as is a major cause of climate change. But on a social side, we also see that there has been other impacts associated with the intensification of agriculture. This includes the pressure to continue to grow at a faster clip, a faster rate, debts that farmers have to absorb more and more as the concentration and the power of agri-industries becomes stronger. So I am going to kind of focus here on a very socio-economic and socio-political understanding of what are the implications of putting in place a payment for ecosystem service. So I don't want to go too much into detail about what it is, as we've already heard from Anne and Chloe. But just to say that it's really a mechanism to promote negotiation in a voluntary way between actors through the use of incentives as a way to encourage adoption of agri-environmental practices. So ALUS is an NGO which was created by the Garfield Weston Foundation. So as some of you may know, Weston family is one of the major entrepreneurs in Canada, having set up the Loblaws chain of supermarkets. And the ALUS payments specifically go towards soil erosion protection, but water quality in general in agricultural settings. It depends really on the context. In Prince Edward Island, it has become part of the agri-environmental policy of the province since 2008. In Quebec, it started in 2016, and it remains sort of in a pilot phase, but there are 40 producers who are now part of this program. So some brief context in PEI. It was put in place in 2008, shortly after the implementation of agri-environmental regulations, which are some of the most strict in Canada. They require 15-meter buffer zones from waterways. And it was seen to be more positive in comparison to the regulation, because the payments were seen to be a form of recognition. So as Chloe had mentioned, as some aspects that are positive about these programs is that they do provide recognition of agri-environmental benefits that farmers are engaged in. But it's also seen as a success in the case of PEI because of several other factors. There was severe fish kills that had happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, which severely influenced both the oyster industry there as well as the tourism impact. It had tourism impacts. And also in total, the program has resulted in nearly 4,000 hectares being enrolled. It's important to underline here, though, that there has not been any biophysical monitoring in terms of impacts of this program, in terms of water quality improvement or in erosion prevention, because there was no baseline conducted prior to the implementation of this program, as well as the fact that it's impossible to separate it from the impacts of the regulation that were put in place, as well as socio-cultural changes that had happened in the last 10 years over in the use of agri-environmental practices. So these are the practices that are encouraged through the ALICE program and the rate of payment associated with each one. So we have expanding buffer zones beyond the regulated limit. We have planting trees within buffer zones. We have retiring production of root crops on sloping land beyond 5%. And these rates have not changed since 2008. So this is something to keep in mind. So my research question was looking at what can we learn from this program after 10 years of implementation. I based this research or this analysis on a systems agrarian approach, which really takes a sort of landscape, a historical and a geographical perspective to understand how land use drivers emerged and how those influenced land use change at the level of the farm. So I conducted 60 interviews, 40 with producers, and including non-members of the ALICE program, as well as members of the internal committee of ALICE, which is managing the program. So this includes members of the Ministry of Environment and Agriculture, the NGO sector, the industry as well, the potato processing industry, which has a major influence there. And some themes that came out really were the history of land use practices, the opportunities and challenges of carrying out agriculture in the contemporary setting in PEI, expectations for the ALICE program, and perceptions of its efficiency. So very briefly, I want to just look at some of these subjective perceptions. Both members of the program and the internal committee agreed that there was a positive perception that these payments over 10 years have resulted in reduced erosion. But there are also additional ancillary benefits, such as the shade provided by trees in buffer zones, the ability to trap aerian pesticides that are in the air, that are heavily used in industrial potato production. It was seen that these benefits are worth the cost, despite the fact that there are serious management costs associated with managing both grassed waterways and buffer zones. By moving machinery around the landscape, this results in actually reducing the efficiency of production. And also the payments were not sufficient enough to compensate the loss of production value from that land. And so, but this was seen as also worth that loss, because it was seen as a sort of insurance value for the land. And also it helped to defray the guilt or the culpability of having been responsible for future fish kill events. And so you can see from some of these quotes some of the perceptions that some farmers have felt in relation to this program. We're doing this for the environment without which we cannot farm. But when we step back from the program itself and we try to look at how successful this program can be in the long term in terms of its long-term impacts, we have to look at its impacts from a socio-political and a socio-economic perspective. So when we look at what's happening on PEI in terms of industrial potato production, then we start to see a very different picture. We see that the net benefits, the net revenues that potato producers have been receiving has increased, but not at the same rate as, I'm not sure if you can even see that, but it's not the same rate as the outstanding debts. So this means that the costs associated with with fertilizers and pesticides is greater. The increasing cost of the machinery, of pesticides, fertilizers is higher than that, in fact, of the rate of revenue that they are receiving. So farmers in the industry get a price that is assured for their crop, but they are barely surviving in that sense. They're maintaining a position that's quite precarious. In terms of the enrollment in the program, it really did rise for the first 2 years, but then it leveled off afterwards. And so I just want to draw attention to the very first point, just that the pressure as being contracted to the industry to increase yields per year to meet increasing demand in markets around the world is very, very high. So 95% of farmers that I spoke to felt that was an overwhelming priority for what influenced their land use decisions. And so 71% of these farmers agreed that when they take land out of production, for whatever reason, they must either increase production on the land that remains, or they must search new land to compensate for what has been lost. So this is what's called leakage in the literature on payment for ecosystem service. 78% of those 71% said that this had nothing to do with ALICE or the regulations, but it had to do with the market environment in which they're operating in. Whereas 22% felt that this is directly linked to impositions of regulation and programs that are not in line with the market environment in which they're operating in. So this brings to attention a much bigger, a bigger kind of picture that we can look at. If we look at this from the broader supply chain, we see that the ALUS program is operating in a context in which you have suppliers, potato processing suppliers on the North American scale, who are competing in which PEI farmers are competing. The Cavendish, the Irving family, which is that which is operating on PEI, is competing with others on the North American scale. And then you have the retailers, which include the quick service restaurants and the supermarket chains, which are demanding increasing quality, not necessarily in relation to the environment, but in relation to the grade of the potato, in relation to the firmness, the taste, the texture, etc. And it's interesting because you see that the Loblaws, which is also one of the retailers in this chain, is the one that's financing the ALUS program. So here, it really makes us think, what if we are trying to promote ecosystem services, but we're contextualizing this within this broader supply chain, we see that we are actually priming the land for greater production when we are protecting ecosystem services. So we need to be very careful when we think about that, and especially when consumption is increasing in markets far away from sites of production. So in conclusion, I think it's not enough to just look at this political economy. We need to also see what is the autonomy of farmers, in this case, to enact alternative socio-ecological relations through incentives like PES. So there is this voluntary aspect of PES, but we need to kind of contextualize it in terms of in what degree is it voluntary? Because if it's voluntary only in terms of the supply chain in which they are operating in, then they are very limited. It's what's considered a very constrained form of autonomy. But can we vision a payment for ecosystem service that can negotiate incentives for alternative socio-ecological relations that are at the same time collective as they are individual? And it's important to note that farmers are themselves it's not black and white. They are business people too. They are also looking for profit, and in many cases they are surviving because of the hope that they will be able to sell their land to the industry when they retire. So. And this piece has been published in Land Use Policy, so I encourage you to all have a look at that closer. And just very briefly, I'm going to touch on the ALUS program as it's operating in Quebec. As I mentioned, this has just started since 2016. My colleague Alejandra Zaga-Mendez can respond to questions if there are something specific about this. But just to say that from what we have done, we've carried out 10 interviews with agronomists with the UPA Montérégie and with producers. So it's important to note that this program is really only operating in Montérégie at the moment. The types of practices that are encouraged through the ALUS Quebec in Montérégie are a little bit different from PEI. So you have pollinator strips, you have buffer zones around lakes, as well as reforestation in wetland areas. And the main characteristics are that farmers really are accompanied by an agronomist, by the UPA, and by, in some cases, a watershed basin organization. So here the UPA has a really strong role in promoting and implementing this program and in its evolution and its development. And it's also important to note that the payment that farmers receive is not enough for the implementation of these practices. So they really have to search additional funding to be able to implement them. And so there is a very strong interaction as well with this program with the subsidies of Prime Vert. And so in this schema, you can see that there is a strong linkage, particularly around the need to have a plan d'accompagnement agro-environmental. So because it's really the same actors that are working with these farmers, you see that there is a strong interaction between these two programs. And so in conclusion, it's some very, very preliminary points to say is that to look at some of the benefits that we might see on a long-term scale from the ALICE program in Quebec in terms of conservation of soil and erosion prevention, we cannot separate that from the dependence on financing and the long-term aspects of that financing. And also that it's not enough to just be a motivated farmer. You have to be in a particular network. You have to be associated with particular actors. You have to have already built up that network. You have to be able to conform to the rules and regulations associated with the programs as well. So it's not necessarily that motivation by the farmer is enough. Yeah, so I will conclude there. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Vijay?
Hi, Vijay. Thanks for your presentation. You were saying that the amounts given per hectare for the 5 or 6 measures that are paid for are relatively low compared to the cost the farmers incur. I find them on the side of the payer relatively high per hectare. Do you think that ALICE program, which is, if I understand correctly, a private program, would be reproducible from a state perspective nationwide?
It's a little bit, that's a kind of a tricky question because every jurisdiction is very, very different. And even just comparing Quebec ALICE in Quebec and ALICE in PEI, we already see how different those jurisdictions can be. And so it's very difficult to imagine that would happen on a national scale. And there has also been pushback against that on the part of the Federation of Agriculture that operates on the Canadian scale. Yeah.
La différence, c'est que dans le cas de l'île du Prince-Édouard, puis je pense que tu l'expliquais au tout début, il y a un financement qui est conjoint avec le financement provincial. Donc, qu'est-ce que nous, on voit dans le cas du Québec, c'est que indirectement, ce financement conjoint s'est fait parce que Prime Vert est en train de financer l'installation, puis de l'autre côté, ALUS finance les paiements par année. Là, ce qu'on s'appelle, si on essaie de voir le paiement au niveau national, là, je pense que justement de voir chaque juridiction, puis c'est le prix de la terre en Montérégie, par exemple, qui est plus haut qu'ailleurs. Et ça, c'était un des enjeux aussi qui était mentionné dans nos entretiens. Donc, je comprends du côté de payeur, mais du côté du receveur, la part de l'agriculteur, eux, ils voient beaucoup par rapport au prix de la terre puis du coût d'option.
Thank you. Bert?
Une sorte de contradiction dans la façon comment le système fonctionne. Il y a d'un côté, il y a une approche qui est très économique, une approche très néolibérale pour faire des paiements. C'est une approche qui est très demandée par le UPA, par exemple. Et de l'autre côté, je sens qu'il y a une pression plutôt sociale qui demande qu'il y ait des règlements, qui fait en sorte comme quoi on veut améliorer la qualité d'eau. Alors, c'est comme s'il y a une compétition entre le social versus l'approche néolibérale, l'un versus l'autre. Et est-ce que tu as regardé ça un peu, à quel point que ça peut jouer un rôle dans la façon comment la société fonctionne?
Oui, c'est vraiment l'enjeu principal. C'est vraiment l'enjeu principal qu'il faut faire face. En fait, c'est cette contradiction entre le monde du marché néolibéral puis aussi l'aspect social. Mais c'est pour ça qu'au final, j'ai dit qu'il faut peut-être penser plus vers l'autonomie des producteurs. Parce que si on parle de l'autonomie, on pourrait peut-être ajouter le parti social en même temps qu'on pourrait identifier des façons, des chemins pour échapper d'un modèle qui peut, c'est pas vraiment propice pour protéger l'environnement. Donc, à la fin de compte. Donc, il y a très peu de recherches sur l'autonomie, quand on parle de l'autonomie des producteurs, de faire de quoi qu'ils veulent faire. Donc, ils sont vraiment piégés dans un système, donc il faut écouter de leurs besoins et de savoir s'il y a des possibilités d'échapper d'un seul modèle comme ça.
Kat?
You said there was no baseline data for PEI. For the new programs, are they capturing some of that baseline data before? And not just from what the effects on the phosphorus levels or water quality, but also on the perceptions of the farmers themselves. Do they change over time? Is that part of what's happening when they start new programs? Do you know?
You mean new ALICE programs?
Yeah, or any of these pay-for-service programs.
Actually, no, unfortunately. Like,
What?
there has been, at least on PEI, in the scale of PEI, they really do need people who can come and, I mean, the problem is even if they do that research, there's very little in the way that it's too late, you know, they didn't do a baseline. And so it's very hard to even, you can do a baseline according to what's now and then continue to examine that, but they haven't. And actually, ALICE is changing its model. It's moving more towards a portfolio approach where buyers or particular interests can purchase a credit, and then that credit will go for it will go into their portfolio. So then that credit will mean a particular landscape will be protected or preserved in a particular area, matched to the needs of the buyer. So they're moving towards that model. So I haven't seen emphasis being made in terms of evaluation.
Do you think that part of that is the protectionism of the farmers themselves? Don't want people testing near their waterways before?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Vijay.
Merci.